Greetings, my dear viewer. This is a channel about marital infidelity and about the consequences if one spouse starts to cheat on the other. If you, as well as I do, support true family values and condemn cheating, then subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Let's get started. The night had all the ingredients for disaster. An undercurrent of resentment mixed with frustration simmering just below the surface. Then, without warning, things took a turn, plunging into something much darker, or perhaps brighter, depending on how much fury I was willing to admit I was harboring. And there was no shortage of that. By the time the clock struck 11 p.m., I was sitting alone in the dim confines of my living room. Only a single floor lamp cast its glow, barely enough to illuminate my immediate surroundings. I'd been consumed by my work for hours, completely unaware of the deep darkness creeping beyond the edges of the light. The oppressive gloom felt like a reflection of my inner turmoil. With my legs crossed, I balanced a yellow legal pad on my lap, its surface filled with chaotic scrawls and carefully organized lists. I was wholly immersed in my thoughts when the sharp, unexpected sound of the doorbell shattered my concentration. My head jerked up as the silence of the house suddenly became apparent. Who would show up at such a late hour? It couldn't be my wife. She'd long abandoned any pretense of returning early from her girls' nights out. I set the legal pad and pen down on the floor, a wave of fatigue washing over me. Not the kind that comes from exertion, but the bone-deep exhaustion that settles in after living a life that feels like it's slowly eroding you. Pulling myself to my feet, I trudged to the door and flipped on the porch and hallway lights. Peering through the peephole, I saw two police officers standing stiffly on the front step. That's never a good sign. Bracing myself, I opened the door and attempted a disarming smile. "What trouble am I in now?" I quipped, hoping to inject some levity. Neither officer so much as smirked. This wasn't a casual visit. "Are you Zachary Novak?" the officer closest to the door asked. "Yes," I replied evenly. "And is your wife, Bonnie Novak?" "That's correct," I said, my curiosity now piqued. "What's this about?" Police officers are rarely straightforward. "May we come inside?" the lead officer asked, already inching forward as if expecting my permission. I stepped into his path, holding my ground. "No." The officer blinked, clearly unaccustomed to being denied. "Excuse me?" I said no. "You'll answer my question or leave," I said, the edge in my voice unmistakable. He stepped back, momentarily thrown off. "Have you been home all evening?" I folded my arms and stared him down like an intruder who had overstayed his welcome. "Yes. And that's the last answer you're getting until you tell me why you're here." My tone sharpened, and after a brief pause, the officers exchanged a glance before conceding. "Your wife has been injured and taken to Memorial Hospital," the lead officer finally said. In an instant, my thoughts shifted. Moments ago, I was meticulously plotting my wife's downfall, but now worry overwhelmed me. "What happened?" I asked, genuinely concerned. The officers remained vague. "May we come in?" the senior officer repeated. With a heavy sigh, I stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. They moved cautiously into the living room, their steps deliberate, as though walking into hostile territory. I flicked on the overhead light and slumped back into my chair. "Now, will you tell me what's going on?" I pressed, frustration creeping into my voice. The officers exchanged another glance before the senior one spoke. "Sir, we regret to inform you that your wife was shot earlier this evening." His words felt rehearsed, carefully measured, but they struck me like a blow. My mouth went dry. "Is she alive?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "She's in surgery," he replied. "Her condition is critical, but there's hope." Anger flared within me. "You didn't answer my question. Is she alive or not?" I demanded, my voice rising. Their hesitation was palpable, but eventually, the senior officer elaborated. "She's still alive, but her prognosis is uncertain. The weight of those words hit me like a punch to the gut. My chest tightened, and I struggled to breathe, gasping like a drowning man. The officers knelt beside me, urging me to focus on breathing. Embarrassed by my reaction, I nodded mutely and tried to regain my composure. "She was shot?" I asked once I steadied myself. The question hung heavy in the air. My mind raced with a troubling thought I dared not say aloud. Who besides me would want to do that? "Is there anything else you can tell me?" I asked, my voice steadier now. The officers straightened, resuming their formal demeanor. "Your wife was at a motel with another man," the senior officer began, his tone businesslike. "From what we've gathered, his wife must have arrived unexpectedly. She likely knocked on the door, and he opened it without thinking. She then fired multiple rounds, hitting them both. The man was killed instantly. Your wife was luckier. She survived, though not unscathed." The full scope of the situation left me reeling. "So you're here to see if I had anything to do with this?" I asked, piecing the puzzle together. Their expressions remained unreadable. "We know who pulled the trigger," the officer admitted. "But we need to confirm there was no additional involvement, and we have to ensure your wife's safety when she returns home." I couldn't suppress a bitter smile. "She's been safe for weeks." "Why would that change now?" I said, my sarcasm flying over their heads. On a whim, I reached for a manila envelope beside my chair. The younger officer tensed, his hand hovering near his holster. "Relax," I said flatly. "It's just paperwork." I handed the envelope to the senior officer. "I visited my lawyer earlier today. She suggested I start making lists," I explained, gesturing toward the legal pad on the floor, littered with notes for the impending divorce. Inside the envelope were photos of my wife, with a man I didn't recognize. The officer flipped through them, his face impassive. "Do you know the man's name?" I asked. The officer didn't look up. "I think you already do," he said. His younger partner, breaking his silence for the first time, muttered, "They look different without the bullet holes." His superior shot him a sharp reprimand before turning back to me. "Apologies for his comment. He's still learning." I waved it off, unbothered. There were more pressing matters at hand. My wife's life hung by a thread, and for now, the divorce would have to wait. Life had once again taken a turn I hadn't anticipated. Once again, I repeated that I'd been home all evening, pointing out the timely phone call from my brother that supported my alibi. They didn't let me off the hook easily, firmly reminding me not to harm my wife when she returned. I didn't see the value in adding more detail, so I stuck to my story. It seemed to satisfy them. When they were ready to leave, I walked them to the door, turned off the lights, and returned to my chair. Sitting back down, I tried to process the shocking news they'd just delivered. She'd been shot. Of all the scenarios I'd envisioned, that one hadn't even crossed my mind. As much as I despised her for what she'd done, I never wanted her dead. I'd hoped she'd live with the weight of her actions, crying herself to sleep in an empty bed, abandoned by others just as she'd betrayed me. Though deep down, I knew she'd never feel that kind of remorse. The night had begun with me immersing myself in tasks my lawyer had given me, desperate to quiet the endless storm of questions her betrayal had stirred in my mind. Now I knew who was involved, but the motive remained a mystery. Sure, our marriage had seen its fair share of rough times. What marriage doesn't? But she had a talent for unearthing faults where none existed, even digging for reasons to be unhappy. It wasn't until our divorce created some distance that I fully understood how deep it ran. Whatever had driven her to sabotage her life had now ensnared me in a murder investigation. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to click into place. I wasn't the only victim in her web of deceit. Grabbing my phone, I dialed my lawyer's private line. She picked up after 4 rings, her tone sharp and impatient. "This better be urgent or you'll be funding my next vacation," Karen snapped. Karen Thompson wasn't the warm and fuzzy type, but her no-nonsense demeanor gave me a strange sense of security. As a divorce lawyer, she was sharp and relentless, though she could crack a joke when least expected. "And who says I'm joking?" she added when I didn't respond. "I need you to find a criminal lawyer, preferably one who's still awake." I heard a loud thud on her end. "Please tell me you didn't do anything reckless," she demanded. "I didn't," I said quickly. "But someone else did. The police just left my house." Her tone sharpened even more. "Why were they there?" "Her lover's wife shot them. He's dead, and she's in surgery. The wife is going to need a lawyer. I doubt she has one." Karen let out a long sigh. "First, tell me, did you have anything to do with this? And say it like you mean it." "I had nothing to do with it," I replied firmly. "Say it like I should believe you," she pressed. "I'm telling the truth," I insisted. "The police came by to inform me. I think they suspect me, but I wasn't involved." "All right," she said after a pause. "Then why is this your concern?" "It shouldn't be. But if we hadn't had that conversation in your office, I might have been the one in that hospital bed. I just want to make sure she's not completely alone in this." Karen sighed again. "Do you know where they've taken her?" "Probably to the police station. This town isn't big enough for much else." "Stay where you are. I'll find someone to handle this and make sure she's got representation. And, Zachary?" "Yes?" "Don't do anything stupid. Keep your distance, at least 10 feet, and make sure you've got witnesses if you're ever near her." "Understood." "And Zachary? You're not responsible for this. None of it. It's going to be okay. Do you hear me?" "Yes, ma'am," I said, hanging up the phone with a faint smirk. Only Karen had the ability to make me feel like a reprimanded teenager. After a quick shower and change of clothes, I drove to the hospital. There was no need to rush. The love I once felt for Bonnie had died long before tonight. This wasn't about her. It was about doing what was necessary, like ensuring her insurance covered the medical bills and the staff didn't cut corners. When I arrived, Bonnie was out of surgery, stable, and heavily sedated in recovery. The surgeon assured me she'd pull through. I left the hospital staff with her insurance details and headed home, asking them to call if anything changed. It was well past midnight by the time I got back. Too restless to sleep, I started mentally ticking off tasks. One thing couldn't wait: calling her parents. I picked up the phone and dialed. Her father, Joe, answered groggily. "Do you know what time it is?" "I know, Joe. I'm sorry to wake you, but I needed to call. Bonnie's been hurt." "Hurt? What do you mean?" His voice immediately sharpened. "She was shot. Her lover's wife shot them both. He's dead, and she's in recovery. She's going to survive." There was silence as Joe processed my words. "Shot? What are you talking about? Are you drunk?" "No, Joe. I'm completely sober. The police came by earlier, and I've been to the hospital. She's sedated. There's no need to rush over tonight, but I thought you should know." "Why aren't you with her?" he asked, his tone accusatory. I exhaled, too drained to argue. "Joe, she was shot by her lover's wife. Did you hear what I said? Her lover's wife." "You're insane. Bonnie doesn't have a lover," he said flatly. "She does. Or did. He's dead now, but she's alive," I replied matter-of-factly. Another pause. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer. "Are you sure? Could you be mistaken?" "Am I wrong about her cheating or her getting shot?" I asked, because the answer's no to both. Joe fell silent again. Then, cautiously, he asked, "What are you going to do now?" "I'm sorry, Joe," I said firmly, "but I've already hired a lawyer. I'm divorcing her. Zachary, can't you reconsider?" Joe's voice carried a mix of urgency and concern. "She's been shot. She's going to need your support." "I needed her too, Joe," I replied, my tone sharper than I intended. "But while I needed her, she was off sleeping with someone else." "So that's it?" Joe pressed, searching for some sign of hesitation. "That's it," I confirmed firmly. "I'll make sure she's financially secure through this ordeal, and the lawyers can handle the rest." But I can't keep doing this. The lies, Joe. The lies are worse than the cheating. She looked me in the eye and lied so convincingly that I didn't suspect a thing. Joe paused, taking a moment to let my words sink in. What gave her away? It was the distance, I explained. She started pulling away, making excuses, filling her time with plans that didn't include me. I couldn't ignore it anymore, so I hired a private investigator. He found everything I needed to know. After that, my mind was made up. Joe's shoulders sagged under the weight of disappointment. Her mom and I were hoping for grandkids, you know. We really thought they were in your future. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew how much they wanted that, and I'd wanted it too. Once. I'm sorry, Joe. I truly am, I said quietly. Just one favor, he asked, and I braced for it. Can you wait? Hold off on making anything final until Bonnie has recovered and the two of you have had a chance to talk. But that wasn't all. And don't disappear. Marie and I see you as the son we never had. No matter what happens with Bonnie, we don't want to lose you. I was blindsided. After all the deceit, the betrayal, and the chaos, this was the moment that finally broke me. For the first time, I felt tears threatening to fall. I love you and Marie too, Joe. I really do. I'm not going anywhere, I promised him. When the call ended, I felt utterly drained. Fully clothed, I collapsed onto my bed and slipped into a heavy, dreamless sleep. The next morning, sunlight streamed through my window, dragging me reluctantly into consciousness. Unready to face the day, I lowered the blinds, stripped off my clothes, and crawled back under the covers for 2 more hours of fitful but necessary rest. Eventually, I forced myself to shower, dress, and grab a quick meal before heading to the hospital. By the time I arrived at Bonnie's room around 11, her parents were already there. To my surprise, she was awake and alert. I'd expected her to still be under heavy sedation, but apparently I didn't know much about recovering from a gunshot wound. I braced myself for regret, perhaps even an apology. Instead, her eyes lit with fury the moment I entered the room. "You bastard!" she spat. "You killed him, didn't you? You killed Ben!" So much for the tired excuse that it didn't mean anything. Before I could respond, 2 nurses rushed into the room, brushing past me, and a pair of orderlies appeared at my side, clearly treating me like a potential threat. I held her gaze, completely unshaken. "No, Bonnie," I said coldly. "His wife killed him. I guess you and Ben weren't as careful as you thought, or maybe she's just smarter than I was." That silenced her. She slumped back into the bed, tears streaking her face, while the staff moved to console her. A moment later, they asked me to leave, and I didn't put up a fight. Walking down the hallway, I couldn't shake the thought. Had I ever really known this woman? One thing was certain. She had never truly known me. Near the elevator, 2 security guards intercepted me. "Sir, could we have a word?" "No," I replied curtly. "I've already spoken to the police and they've cleared me. If you want to involve them again, go ahead. But I won't let the baseless accusations of a cheating woman give you authority over me. If you touch me, I'll sue. Your choice." The guards exchanged uneasy looks as I stepped into the elevator and left the hospital. The police never contacted me again. Bonnie tried to file charges, but when the shooter confessed at the scene, there wasn't much of a case. As for the shooter, Melody Robinson, I hired a lawyer to ensure she was placed in a psychiatric facility instead of prison. I visit her occasionally. She's lucid, perhaps more so than most people I know. Once she even quipped, "Think you could smuggle in a hacksaw for me? Maybe in a box of chocolates?" That's when I realized she might be saner than the rest of us. My lawyer had done right by her. The divorce was a straightforward ordeal. Bonnie didn't want me. She wanted everything else. She demanded all we owned and a share of my future earnings. In the end, she got half of what we had, and no alimony. The judge, unimpressed by her entitlement, told her plainly, "You have a job, Mrs. Novak. You can work. I've often considered tattooing those words on my arm. Looking back, I'm grateful for three things: an excellent lawyer who guided me through the mess, two remarkable in-laws who still treat me like family, and a judge who wasn't afraid to be blunt. As for Bonnie, she rarely crosses my mind. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.